As the standoff inside Venezuela and on its borders continues, there's a range of images and stories coming out of the Latin American country, and they tell many different stories. Western countries are standing behind opposition leader Juan Guaido, who invoked Venezuela's constitution to assume an interim presidency last month. Now, as President Nicolas Maduro closes its border with Colombia to a convoy of US aid it says is needed to help with the humanitarian crisis inside Venezuela. Now, once a oil-rich nation, Venezuela now suffers from hyperinflation as well as food and medicine shortages, and protesters say they're desperate for help.
It's a hard situation here. Food is expensive. There is no food. The people are hungry in Venezuela. It's not a lie. Listen up, international community. This is not a lie.
It's necessary for aid to cross into Venezuela today. The statistics speak for themselves. The College of Medics reports that the shortage in medicine is at 85%. Hospitals are in a bad state, and it's the same for food and prices.
But there's another narrative being put forward, one that seeks to give credence to President Maduro's insistence that the US is creating a false crisis in order to gain power over Venezuela, and that the failing economy is the creation of US sanctions. US Vice President Mike Pence announcing fresh US sanctions against Maduro's allies on Monday after meeting with Latin American leaders, including Juan Guaido in Colombia. This reporter speaks with a resident of Caracas who says the humanitarian aid is not needed.
Nos necesitan ayuda humanitaria de los Estados Unidos.
No, señor.
They don't need the humanitarian aid from the U.S. Tienen todo lo que necesitan.
Sí, señor.
Sí.
Lleve esa noticia ya, que no necesitamos nada.
She's saying, tell the news that
Lo que queremos
truth.
es que nos quiten el bloqueo que nos tiene los Estados Unidos a Venezuela.
People here seem to have as much food as they can purchase. There are hundreds of people waiting outside to come in, and you can see someone picking up their food right here, getting pasta.
Now, these dual narratives, of course, see the United States, on the one hand, slamming the Venezuelan president for holding its population hostage, while Maduro says the US is exaggerating the story.
Everything the United States government has done is doomed for failure. They're trying to fabricate a crisis to justify political escalation and a military intervention in Venezuela to bring a war to South America.
And joining me in studio, international affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini. Bianca, there are, of course, multiple narratives, and this show is all about looking at the multiple lenses and views to any given story. Let's look at why we're seeing these multiple narratives and how much they really represent what's going on inside the country.
Well, I think they represent exactly what's going on in the country. They really speak to what's the core issue here. On the one hand, we've got Nicolas Maduro, who is really the hand-picked successor of Hugo Chavez, who was an icon, a political icon in Venezuela, and who really changed the country in both, in many ways. Let's say that. Let's keep it that way. And then we've got Juan Guaido, who is speaking about changing what's happening and who is representing sort of the Western world. And at the end of the day, it goes back to these very deep-rooted narratives of the left and the right in Latin America, and who's going to lead the country forward.
But of course, we heard from that woman saying we don't want the US aid. It wasn't saying that they don't want the situation to get better. In fact, she was just saying we just want the US to lift those sanctions. I suppose we could align her, of course, more with the Maduro supporter. What do Maduro supporters want? Why do they support him, despite the fact that we're seeing this kind of economic crisis in the country?
So there, of course, are a few elements to this, like there always is in these cases. First of all, we have this very simple narrative that Juan Guaido is seen as being a representative of a foreign force. He's very closely linked to the US, so he's sort of an outsider representing the U.S. imperialism, which is the expression that Maduro uses again and again, and that he took over from his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. But at the end of the day, it all goes back to the legacy of Hugo Chavez. I want to go back a little bit in history for us to understand this. In the 90s, Venezuela faced a wave of economic crises, and Chavez was elected to save the country. And despite him coming in already from the beginning, being a controversial leader, having a lot of authoritarian tendencies, he also did lift millions of people out of poverty. He built hospitals, he built community centers, and helped a lot of impoverished people who are still today thankful to him, and who still see him as the savior who really made the gap between rich and poor in Venezuela smaller. And this is what Maduro is living on still
So
today.
let's talk about that demographic. Who are, of course, we know that the military stands behind him, but then who are the civilians? What kind of a demographic do they come from?
Mostly we're talking lower class, we're talking poor people who had, who saw a significant change in their life in the 90s, in the 2000s, early 2000s, and who still today can point to this narrative of socialism and this narrative of communism that Chavez put forward and really underlined, and that Maduro is continuing with, saying that this helped them out of their misery. And then they are now, it's very simple. After the U.S. started putting sanctions on Venezuela, it really gave Maduro now a chance to point a finger and blame the U.S. for the situation. So they see, a lot of these people who support Maduro essentially see him as fighting against a U.S.-waged war on Venezuela.
So let's look at the other side of...
or physical.
Let's look at the other side of the narrative then. Let's go back again and look at what prompted the United States under Barack Obama to impose those sanctions on Venezuela.
So when Obama in 2015 imposed sanctions, it was part of a larger package, let's say, of sanctions. They were imposed again and again and again. And there are different reasons to this. Some critics say that this was really, at the end of the day, the U.S. way to deal with an unpleasant regime, and that they were seeing someone in their backyard, this is what Latin America has been called again and again, who has a lot of oil and who doesn't play by the American rules, and on top of that, who is steering the country in a horrible direction, More poverty, more uprising, and not a friend of the U.S. So this is the overall narrative that we hear.
Sure, and so you're pointing to the fact that, of course, the United States has been, for a long time, accused of, in fact, using Venezuela's vulnerabilities, in fact, to engage in what was up until last month, and then again we're seeing these further sanctions being imposed. On Monday, that was almost a low-grade economic war. Now they're calling it almost a full-scale economic assault under these sanctions by Trump, and now we've seen more announced by Pence. So what does the U.S. stand to gain?
Well, right now, first of all, the U.S. is really putting pressure on it, and I think it's important for us to look at this aid that we're seeing trying to enter Venezuela as more than just aid. It's not just aid. If Maduro were to allow this aid to enter the country, he would essentially be acknowledging his failure. And the U.S. knows this. Juan Guaido knows this, and that's why they put this aid where it did, so visually at the border with all the press looking at it. So at the end of the day, we are looking at different interests. And again, for the U.S., Venezuela is a country that has not been wanting to play by American rules. They've got a lot of oil, and ideologically speaking, they represent the old foe, right?
But that we can obviously understand Venezuela's resistance from that perspective. But it isn't just the United States. Many Western countries support the opposition leader, Juan Guaido.
Absolutely. But that said, when it comes to talking about military intervention, that is essentially only the U.S. who's saying that we keep this option on the table. We just heard from the Brazilian Vice President saying that they're not going to allow the U.S. to use Brazilian troops to invade Venezuela. And this is something that we've heard about a lot for a long time in Brazil. And just here I just want to add a little personal touch. As someone who grew up with family in Latin America, it is a very, very conflicting narrative, because you see a country that is falling apart, that is a huge humanitarian crisis, and then we look at the history of Latin America with the U.S. meddling, the U.S. intervening in domestic affairs, and really it sparks a lot of conflicting emotions.